We've been hearing a lot about data in the last session as well, and I wanted to just kick things off with a sort of high-level question for you guys. Are we working with too much data or not enough data? And by that I mean, do we have access in the way that we want to have access and to the right kinds of data? Amy, could you kick things off?
So my first thought about your question is that we've got a lot of data, and the number one task first is to make sense of it and decide where are the holes we need to fill in. We almost have a patchwork quilt going on right now, where some areas we have really, really deep, rich, large data sets, and then other areas where there's a paucity of data, and then other areas where there may be a lot of data, but it's not very clean enough quality that we can use and rely on, and our task is to start to figure that out.
Just, by the way, share really quickly what your mission is at Flatiron.
So Flatiron Health is a health technology company focused on organizing cancer data in order to accelerate research and improve cancer care delivery.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah, so I actually think we've got enough data out there, but there are aspects, as Amy referenced, where we could have more data. And I think in an area like genomics, there's going to be extraordinary opportunity to leverage genomic data. I think also we often forget about some of the other data pieces like social, environmental data, and behavioral data. So as we think about connecting data across all these different sources, we often focus on the EMR data, the data that's in a healthcare setting. But frankly, in a healthcare setting, you only spend a few hours a year, typically with your doctor if you're relatively healthy or if you have some chronic diseases. There's so much other data out there that we need to connect and get. What we ultimately need to do is get insights from that data. And so what we often like to say at Watson and IBM is that 80% of that data that's out there is invisible, and there's opportunities to make it more visible.
Okay.
I think our position from a policy perspective is that there is a two-tiered process that's at play. It's not so much that there is enough data. I think that there are more data sources, and particularly patient-generated health data, that we don't have access to. But the second tier is even after we have access to data, it's how you partition the data, analyze the data, use the data. I think we're lacking in both at this point. Too much of the data in the health system is siloed, and too much of the data that's generated by and for patients is not available for both research and care delivery.
So keeping on that point, what are you doing, what is your organization doing to alleviate some of the regulatory hurdles on that front?
We're particularly interested in moving data and having it available for patients at the point of care or researchers. So we've taken a three-tiered approach to that. We think that there's a cultural issue around data exchange. It's not the expectation that data is moved from place to place. Often patients don't expect that the data is theirs for their personal use or to use it for second opinions. Doctors are sometimes offended when people ask for their data specifically. We think there's a payment aspect as well. And so we've done a lot of work at ONC with our friends at CMS and others in the ecosystem to make sure that there's a payment structure that allows for information flow. In particular, there are levers and there are instances where people have to act against their own best financial interest to exchange data. We think that's a problem. And the third effort that we're engaged in is really on standards. And the idea with standards is we want to have national standards and we want to recognize them from the federal government. We think in an area where the technology moves as quickly as it does, it would be a mistake for us to only mandate those standards. Our idea is to point to national standards and to use that public-private partnership to help us get to the right standards. So those are the three approaches we think are most important.
So is this not in any way a technology problem at this point? Are we beyond that?
I'll let you start.
Yeah, no, I think, what I love, health and healthcare is fundamentally about relationships. And ultimately, technology needs to be leveraged to improve those relationships and ultimately lead to better value. So technology, if you look at Good to Great by Jim Collins, he talks about it as an accelerator for progress. And ultimately, it is about the relationship. So as I think about kind of my own experience as a primary care physician, originally in underserved settings in DC, I remember I had a big data challenge. I had the medical records that I would get every day. I would also get journals every week, 3 or 4 journals. I would also have my textbooks for internal medicine and pediatrics, so taking care of kids and adults. And it was humanly impossible for me to know everything in those charts. It was humanly impossible for me to know all the studies, especially now there are 8,000 studies a day that are published. And it's humanly impossible to know everything in the textbooks. So how can we create an opportunity where we leverage that big data into a form of AI, which I would say actionable insights? And that's the exciting opportunity here. And how do we leverage technology to do that? And at IBM, we've been doing that in the area of cancer especially. We've done extraordinary work where we've got the 300 medical journals, 200 medical textbooks, and access to get insights from those EMRs and bring it all together at the point of care for an oncologist in a place like Bangkok, Thailand, to get an actionable insight and to help provide better care to that patient.
I've heard you guys are also trying to figure out why Italians have such a long life expectancy, but that's a very pressing.
I have some theories for that. Yeah.
Do you have theories? Does Watson have theories?
Well, that's an extraordinary partnership we have with the Italian government. So it's interesting in looking at life expectancy, because think about it. We've gained 30 years of life expectancy in about 100 years. So in 1900, we all lived to the mid-40s. And now our life expectancy around 80. Actually, so the Prime Minister Renzi talks about this. I was in a setting where he talked about how Japan's #1 right now in life expectancy. So he was talking about, we're going to beat Japan. We're going to beat Japan. You're going to help us figure out what it is. And to me, there's aspects of social connectedness that you see in places like Italy. There's aspects of nutrition and diet that are a big role. And so as we think about all the types of data we need to connect to get those insights that are actionable, we need to consider these other data sets, not just what's in the healthcare setting.
So it actually is a big data problem. And you talk about oncology's big data problem, and again, we touched on this a bit in the previous session, but talk about sort of what your 3 solutions to that, or the 3 points of the solution.
So, oncology actually acts as a microcosm. And as we think about solving the big data problem across healthcare, we actually need to think about each of the different disease areas differently, because in fact, across different therapeutic areas, we have different issues. And, the first part of this is recognizing that as we bridge science and clinical care so that the two are mutually forming, the electronic health record does actually act as a data backbone that forms the mechanism through which all the other data sets can then be organized around. And so that's one part, is to use the EHR as a data backbone. But it turns out that even when we advance interoperability, we might make it easier to move the electronic health record between institutions, but we're still moving what essentially is digital paper. And so a lot of the key variables that we need to conduct our science live within the PDFs now of our medical case notes, of the radiology reports. It might even be the condolence card that's the best signal that this patient has died. And so a key task that we focus on at Flatiron is how do we mine those documents, and actually it takes real people to pull out the key data points and put them into the data sets in an organized fashion so that they're analyzable. And then the third part is, in order to do a lot of the things that you've just been hearing about, pulling these data sets together, you actually have to have a linking agent, a way of saying, for this particular patient, where this is their electronic health record portion of their data set, here is the linking key that allows us to merge in the genomic data or the information about their social determinants of health. And so that linking capability is also the key thing to figure out, and we have a responsibility to figure it out in a safe and private way. And so those are the 3 things we focus on.
So, Zindel, I mean, the condolence card in particular, that's about as unstructured as you can get from, unstructured data, right? So how do you guys look at that? And from a regulatory perspective, how do you approach it?
It's an interesting point. So clearly it's possible that through our certification program of EHRs, we could be very prescriptive about those data elements. But the real question is, what's the right role of government in that space? And so we have, wherever possible, aimed for public-private partnerships in that way. We, as part of the certification program, did have 22 common clinical data elements that were published for this 2015 certification process, which will be live in all facilities at 2018 is the target date. But the fact of the matter is, you really don't want to depend on peeling through PDFs and that kind of data analysis. That is not really going to allow us to achieve the true efficiency and the data dividend that we talk about a lot in healthcare. That really depends on us sort of moving closer to specific data elements, being able to move interoperably between systems.
I want to just expand on that, though. So what's really interesting, when I was at Duke, so I was at Duke for 20 years before coming to Flatiron, and this was actually something that we studied. How do you get to parsimony so that you get to the key data elements that, as public-private partnerships, we've endorsed this must be collected in a structured and consistent way without over-rotating on turning clinicians into data gatherers. And so we have a task together as a community of saying, these are the things we absolutely need, and then these are the other data elements that we'll leave to the private space, or we'll leave to a whole bunch of other ways of collecting data and linking them in order to do this well.
So, and these kind of data points also bring up another interesting question, which is who owns the data ultimately? And you guys you have interesting origins. The company was founded by two guys, right, who had a display ad company before that they sold to Google. You guys have funding from Google. So I think it's an appropriate question because obviously there's, Google's kind of mastered the big data thing. Who owns the data ultimately?
So first of all, as a person, the patient owns the data. Like the starting point needs to be, as the public and society, individual patients own the data. Even at Flatiron, that is our point of view, is that the data that originates in a clinic is still owned by the clinic and the patients that represent the clinic. And we're essentially licensing just the processing piece back. So where we've pulled the data points and put them from the unstructured documents into the structured documents, we're licensing that back to the clinical space or others who use it. But actually, as a society, we have to sort of think about this from the point of view first of patients own our own data, and then that information gets pulled together. The other side of that, though, is as patients, we think about how do we put our data to use. And really that is the conversation as a community we need to be having about how do we make sure information is being put to use in service of our own health as well as health going forward.
I would agree. The patient owns the data, and as we think about data, fundamentally the role of the patient is very essential, and they need to be aware of how that data is being used and how it ultimately should provide value. Because that's a key piece in this equation, that big data without value is ultimately not going to lead to the integration and the interconnectedness and the intelligence and the insights that we need to find. So one way I like to frame it is there's 5 V's of big data. So there's the volume of data. Patients need to realize there's an extraordinary amount of data. Each of us will produce 300 million books worth of data in our lifetime. There's a variety of that data. There's the clinical data, that's the genomic data, the social, the environmental data. The zip code data is very relevant to data, and behavioral data. Then there's the velocity of that data that is so rapid, especially in this age where there's all these apps, there's all these tools, there's all these wearables, and there's actually quite a bit of knowledge that's being circulated around value. And there's veracity of that data as well. And then the last thing is the value. So
the 5 W's of journalism.
That's right. But this concept of data, trust, and philanthropy, I wish we could convert the conversation from which we need to be. Data is ultimately about trust, privacy, security. There's nothing more important than that. You don't share your data with people you don't trust. But how can we start bringing the conversation around this concept of sharing your data in a de-identified way could potentially lead to new discoveries?
As a philanthropic endeavor, basically.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah. Wow.
So I'd just like, if I can, share a thought about this who owns the data question, because in statute, it's pretty clear. So the Office of Civil Rights says a patient's data belongs to the patient. Not only that, but you should be able to get your data and a time and method of your choosing, and it should be at little or no cost. So that's pretty clear from a regulatory perspective. The problem is we're making a shift not only as caregivers in society, but we're also making a shift as members of society. So as we looked at the landscape, there are only 2 states in the country that line up from a statutory perspective. There are over 20 states in the country that say that the patient's medical record belongs to the care provider. if you talk to many patients, I think it's their expectation when they go to receive care that their caregiver has a complete gathering of their records for them to receive the care that's provided. There are only a few small sectors in our country, and the military may be one, where the soldier is expected to show up to a duty station with their medical records in hand or with a folder. At least that's what they used to do 20 years ago when I was in the Army. But the point on it is that it's a cultural shift. And I've heard many people speak about this, and the concept may be that in some instances it's a shared record, where the expectation is if I've engaged in a doctor-patient relationship with you, my expectation is if I've shared my data, back to your trust point, that the provider has some responsibility that continues to guard, protect that data. By the same token, if a patient wants their data for their personal use, to share for research, to look for a second opinion, it's pretty clear that it's the patient's right to that data set.
But the reality is still that that's actually much tougher to do, right, in an execution.
There is still work to be done. We were able to look at some survey data pretty recently that says we're turning the curve on some of it. Most hospitals now allow patients to view that data electronically, at least have the capability for that. About 9 in 10 hospitals have the ability for patients to view and download that data. And about 7 in 10 hospitals have the ability to view, download, and transmit that data. And that's a pretty big increase, almost a 7-fold increase over just a short number of years, since 2012. It used to be 10% allowed that activity. So we're getting the capability in place. There's still barriers that we're working through in terms of making sure that providers get that message, making sure that patients know that it's their right to ask for that information. And we've done some work with the Office of Civil Rights in that space, but it's still work to be done, just as you've underscored.
Okay. Questions from the audience? Raise your hand, please. I will ask you guys another one then. Did you have one? No, you're just saying hi. So I'm curious. Do you guys compete with each other? Do you partner? Do you complement each other? What's your you've both got somewhat similar aspirations in the long run, so.
So honestly, I think it's highly.
Feel free to fight.
No, we're not.
Nah. So if I think about what we do, and I need to stop and make sure that I clarify what we do and why it's complementary, but that's really been our point of view. So at Flatiron, we focus on how do we organize data and get it ready to solve a series of research and care delivery problems. And ultimately, if I think about IBM Watson's core goal, especially in the oncology space, of getting clinical insights back to clinicians, those two things are complementary, where clinical insights get better if the data is really clean, and the ability of us as Flatiron to contribute to the overall ecosystem of bringing insights back into the clinic is better if we have a really high-quality partner who knows how to do this in an awesome way. So I think that's kind of our point of view.
Yeah, I mean, our point of view, and this has been brought up before, is health and healthcare is a team sport. It requires us to work together. Fundamentally, we have the same goal of healthy people and healthy populations, and our goals are very common. And we've got to find ways in which we can collaborate to accelerate through the power of relationships and technology to improve the health of those populations. So, I mean, Amy and I have been talking, there's extraordinary opportunity and synergies in our groups. So we're partners.
I would actually say that there's something else that I've realized as I've sat in my role at Flatiron, coming from the academic space to Flatiron, and even this conversation highlights, and that's that solving a lot of the problems that we've been talking about through data and technology, et cetera, means bringing together what may have seemed historically as unusual partners in the story. And that means that we need to have at the same table clinicians and statisticians and computer scientists, but also business folks and policy, all figuring out the problem on even playing field.
One way I like exactly what Amy says, and the role of the public sector, the private sector, the role of, I mean, once again, the center of it all is patients and populations, but you've got providers, you've got payers, you've got policymakers, you've got purchasers. The role of a purchaser is a very important role. Like at IBM, we now are providing access to Watson for Oncology, Watson Clinical Trials Matching, Watson Genomics to all of our employees and their family members in the U.S. The role of pioneers and entrepreneurs, many of you are in that category. We've got to work together. I like to say at the table of health and healthcare for healthier populations.
And patience.
So,
Well, yeah, the patients, populations.
and I mean, you're painting a picture of like one big happy family. And Vindel, you touched on this earlier, the cultural shift that needs to take place. Put aside regulatory, technological, and those kind of hurdles, but to get you guys at the table and to get all sorts of other companies. I mean, there are so many different parties involved. I mean, I would imagine that in the past this has been seen as much more of a proprietary type of thing that wasn't shared. So what kind of cultural shifts are happening as there are more and more consortiums, more and more attempts at sharing the data?
I'll actually start, and I was looking at Vindela's start, but I'm going to hand you something that I would love to hear your perspective on. I mean, one of the first things that I noticed, and I got very vocal about this in my academic role, was that we didn't do a good job of figuring out how to have equal partners at the table. And this was across, all kinds of different backgrounds. I really, as an oncologist, couldn't hire a computer scientist in the way that I thought was needed in order to solve the problem, because essentially in an academic hierarchy, there wasn't a job slot that made sense within that hierarchy. And I would think that as we think about public-private partnerships, figuring out what equal at the table means is one of the things we got to figure out.
Well, the one thing I would say is that we paid a lot of attention to this idea that it is a team sport, and there does need to be a degree of coordination that may not ordinarily exist, particularly among competitors. We've tried to signal pretty strongly that we think it's a bad idea from an entrepreneurial perspective to concentrate on having silos of data as a key part of your business strategy, because we think that that's the wrong place for the innovation to occur. The public-private aspect of this, particularly when it comes to setting standards, we think it's important to have not the federal government sort of use the blunt arm that we have, that's a powerful arm, but a blunt arm to sort of move this, and rather to have these kinds of partnerships. One last thing I'll share is that we also, in our agency, engage a lot with our advisory councils, our federal advisory councils. Those are ways that by statute we're allowed to bring in opinions to help guide policy. It's one of the things that makes me most hopeful about our work as we go forward. I think if you had any one of these sectors acting alone or in a silo, we would be less confident about our path forward. Because these are collective activities and collective strategies executed as partners around the table, I think we have a very bright future ahead.
And very quickly, in like 1 or 2 sentences from each of you, if we have this discussion in 10 years, where do you think things will stand, other than us having mapped Italians' longevity? Do you want to start, Amy, real quick?
Sure. If I go back to in 10 years, what do I hope to see? I hope to see that we're able to get to compelling clinical evidence that has the responsibility of changing clinical practice back into clinical practice in less than 2 months.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you.
So I'm going to go back 200 years. So in 200 years ago, there was an iconic piece of technology that was created by a French physician called the stethoscope. And so
Maybe 1 sentence, right?
that's 1 sentence.
Okay.
So my second sentence is that in 10 years, the role of cognitive, the role of tools like Watson, will be a part of almost every healthcare decision.
As ubiquitous as the stethoscope.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, I would go back to this learning health system strategy where evidence generation, care provision, and patient-generated health data have free flow of information. That's the world I hope to live in 10 years from now.
All right. Thank you guys so much for joining us.